They said it so calmly that at first I thought I had misunderstood. We were sitting at the dining table, the three of us, plates still warm, the smell of food lingering in the air I had paid for, cooked for, and cleaned for more times than I could count. My son leaned back in his chair and said, almost thoughtfully, "If this is how you choose to live, don't be surprised if you end up miserable." His wife didn't look at me. She kept cutting her food into precise pieces, her mouth set in a neutral line, as if misery were a reasonable consequence for someone like me. I nodded once and said, "I understand." My voice sounded steady, which surprised me. Inside, something went very quiet, the way it does just before a long storm settles in. I left not long after that, carrying my purse close to my chest, my coat buttoned wrong because my fingers felt clumsy. The elevator ride down felt endless. I watched the numbers light up one by one and wondered when I had started feeling like a guest in a place that existed because of me. Outside, the night air was sharp, and I breathed it in deeply, as if oxygen itself might anchor me. I drove home slowly, stopping at every light, not because I had to, but because moving too quickly felt dangerous. When I finally reached my apartment, I didn't turn on the lamp. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and listened to the city breathing around me. Cars passed, someone laughed on the sidewalk below. Life continued, indifferent to the small collapse happening quietly inside my chest. I did not cry that night. I folded my clothes for the next day, lined up my shoes, washed the one plate I had used earlier, and placed it carefully in the cupboard. These were things I knew how to do. They required no permission and no explanation. Lying down, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the word miserable, how easily it had been assigned to me, how confidently, as if it were a role I had agreed to play. Sleep came in short fragments, interrupted by memories I hadn't invited but could not stop. My son had not always spoken to me like that. There was a time when he showed up at my door with a shy smile and asked if I had time, a time when my name sounded softer in his mouth. Those memories didn't hurt as sharply as I expected. They felt distant, like photographs kept too long in the sun. What hurt was the present, the way I had been reduced to a background detail in his life, useful but inconvenient, necessary but easily dismissed. I had raised him alone after his father's long illness took him piece by piece. I worked mornings and nights, cleaned offices when other people slept, came home with aching joints and hands that smelled of chemicals. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself love was enough. When he married, I was happy for him. I believed that was the natural order of things, that children grow outward and parents step back. I did not expect gratitude. I did not expect repayment. I only expected respect. Somewhere along the line, that expectation began to feel unreasonable, even selfish. Every time I hesitated, every time I asked a question, I felt the subtle pressure to apologize for existing at all. I learned to speak less, to wait, to offer help before it was asked for so I wouldn't be accused of withholding it later. The money started quietly, small things at first, a bill that came earlier than expected, a temporary issue that would resolve itself soon. I told myself this was what family did. I told myself my discomfort was a small price to pay for his stability. Over time, the requests became habits, and the habits became expectations. I noticed how rarely my son asked how I was, how quickly conversations turned practical when I tried to talk about my life. My world shrank to what I could provide. When I wasn't providing, I was invisible. That dinner was not the first time I felt dismissed, but it was the first time it was said so plainly. Misery, as if it were already mine, as if my future had been decided without me present. I did not argue because arguing would have required them to see me as someone whose feelings mattered. I smiled because smiling allowed me to leave with my dignity intact, at least on the surface. Inside, something shifted. I did not yet know what I would do. I only knew that whatever came next would not be loud. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The apartment was still, the light pale through the curtains. I made coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching people hurry past with places to be. My phone lay on the table, silent, no message, no concern. I felt strangely calm, the way one does after accepting a truth that can no longer be avoided. I did not anger, I felt clear. There is a difference, and it matters. I showered, dressed, and sat down with my purse and my old notebook, the one where I kept track of things I could not afford to forget, dates, numbers, commitments I had made without ever signing my name. As I turned the pages, I realized how much of my life had been organized around maintaining someone else's comfort, how carefully I had arranged my own discomfort so it would not inconvenience them. The realization did not arrive with drama. It arrived like a quiet acknowledgement between old acquaintances. I was not ready yet, not to speak, not to explain, not to confront, but I understood something that morning that I had avoided for a long time. Misery was not something that waited for me in the future. It was something I had been slowly living in already, disguised as duty, disguised as love. And as I closed my notebook and placed it back in my bag, I felt the weight of a decision forming, still unspoken, still incomplete, but impossible to undo once fully seen. In the days that followed, nothing outwardly changed, which is often how the most important changes begin. My son did not call to check if I was all right. His wife did not send a message to smooth things over or clarify what had been said. Silence settled between us, not dramatic, not hostile, just absent. I continued my routines, because routines are what keep you upright when your thoughts begin to wander into places that feel unsafe. I woke early, made my bed carefully, opened the windows to let the stale air out, and brewed my coffee strong. I swept the small kitchen floor even when it was already clean. These small acts gave me something solid to hold on to, proof that at least one part of my life remained under my control. I thought often about that dinner, not in flashes of anger, but in slow replays. The angle of my son's shoulders when he leaned back, the way his wife avoided my eyes, the confidence with which they spoke about my future, as if it were a settled matter they were merely informing me about. I wondered when I had begun to feel like an inconvenience instead of a person. The answer did not come easily, but I sensed it had been happening for a long time, quietly, while I was busy making sure everyone else was comfortable. My phone rang 3 days later. It was my son. His voice sounded normal, almost cheerful. He asked if I could stop by later in the week because they needed to talk about something. He did not ask how I was. He did not mention our last conversation. I agreed without hesitation, because hesitation always seemed to invite accusations I no longer had the energy to defend myself against. When I hung up, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that told me I was about to be asked for something I would find difficult to refuse. That afternoon, I walked to the grocery store instead of taking the bus. The air was cool, and the movement helped clear my head. I passed couples arguing softly, children tugging at their parents' hands, older men sitting on benches watching the world go by. I wondered if they felt as invisible as I often did. Inside the store, I chose the cheapest bread, the vegetables with the small bruises marked down for quick sale. I had learned long ago how to stretch what little I needed for myself. It had never occurred to me that my restraint might be funding someone else's excess. When I returned home, I sorted through the mail. Bills, flyers, a bank statement I set aside without opening. I told myself I would look at it later. There was no urgency. There never seemed to be, at least not for me. I made soup and ate it slowly, alone at my table, listening to the muted sounds of the television from the neighbor's apartment through the thin wall. In the evening, I folded laundry and caught myself counting how many of my sweaters were older than my son's marriage. The thought lingered longer than it should have. The visit came sooner than I expected. When I arrived at their house, the door was already open. Music played softly somewhere inside. The place looked perfect, staged in a way that suggested ease rather than effort. My son greeted me with a brief hug, distracted, his attention already drifting back to whatever was on his mind. His wife smiled politely and offered me water in a glass that looked too delicate for everyday use. I sat where they directed me and waited. They did not waste time. There was an expense coming up, they explained, something unexpected, something important. The words were familiar, they always were. My son spoke quickly, as if speed might prevent me from interrupting. His wife nodded along, occasionally adding details that made the situation sound more urgent, more reasonable. I listened, hands folded in my lap, feeling that strange calm again, the one that had begun to replace my usual anxiety. When they finished, there was a pause. It was brief, but heavy. They were waiting. I asked a question, just one. I asked how long they expected the situation to last. My son's expression changed immediately. His jaw tightened. His wife's smile disappeared. The air shifted. My question had not been answered. It had been challenged. He reminded me of everything they were juggling, everything they were under pressure to maintain. She mentioned how stressful it was to feel unsupported. I noticed that no one mentioned me, my limits, or my future. Those details had already been filed away as irrelevant. I agreed to help. The words came out automatically, practiced, familiar. Relief washed over their faces so quickly it almost startled me. The tension dissolved. Conversation moved on to other things. Plans, vacations, purchases they were considering. I nodded at appropriate moments, smiled when expected. Inside, I felt something detach, a small but significant separation between what I was saying and what I was feeling. When I left, they hugged me again, warmer this time, satisfied. On the way home, I stopped at a red light and realized my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. I had not raised my voice, I had not argued, I had not even said no, and yet I felt as if I had given something away that I would not easily recover. At home, I sat down and finally opened the bank statement I had avoided earlier. I read through it carefully, line by line, tracing the numbers with my finger. There were patterns there I had not allowed myself to see before. Repeated amounts, automatic withdrawals, commitments that renewed themselves without asking if I was still willing. I closed the statement and placed it back in the envelope. I did not make any decisions that night. I did not tell anyone what I had noticed. Instead, I lay awake listening to the building settle, feeling the quiet weight of awareness press gently but persistently against my thoughts. Something was shifting, slowly, deliberately. I did not yet know what shape it would take, only that the silence I had lived in for so long was no longer empty. It was becoming full of something else, something patient, something observant, something waiting. The invitation arrived in an envelope thicker than necessary, cream-colored, heavy in my hands as if weight alone could suggest importance. I recognized my son's handwriting on the front, careful and controlled, the way he wrote now, not the loose, uneven letters from his childhood. I stood by the door for a moment before opening it, as if delaying might soften whatever waited inside. When I finally did, I found a formal announcement for a celebration dinner they were hosting, a gathering to mark an anniversary related to his wife's family business. The words were polite, generous even, but something about them felt rehearsed. At the bottom, there was a note in his handwriting asking if I could come early to help with a few things, just until the caterers arrived. I told myself this was normal. Families help each other. Mothers help their children. I did not question why I was needed early but listed as a guest in the same breath. I marked the date on my calendar and went on with my day. Still, the envelope stayed on the table longer than it should have, catching my eye every time I passed. It was not excitement I felt, but a familiar tightening, a sense that I was being invited into something that was not meant for me in the way I might hope. In the days leading up to the event, messages came regularly, small requests framed as necessities. Could I cover an additional cost because something had gone up in price? Could I pick up a few items on my way? Could I stay a little later than planned to help clean? Each message ended with a brief expression of appreciation, the kind that feels more like punctuation than gratitude. I answered each one simply, without comment. I noticed how my answers no longer came with explanations or apologies. That, at least, had changed. On the day of the dinner, I dressed carefully, not extravagantly, but neatly, choosing clothes that were clean and well kept, even if they were no longer fashionable. I brushed my hair, pinned it back the way I always had, and checked my reflection one last time before leaving. I did not look out of place, I told myself. I looked like myself. That would have to be enough. When I arrived, the house was already busy, boxes stacked near the entrance, flowers laid out on every surface, people moving quickly from room to room. My son greeted me briefly and pointed toward the kitchen without much conversation. His wife was directing others, her voice calm and efficient. She handed me a list of things to prepare and moved on before I could respond. I rolled up my sleeves and did as I was told. I washed, chopped, arranged. I stayed out of the way. As guests began to arrive, the atmosphere shifted. Laughter grew louder, music played, coats were taken and drinks offered. I noticed how easily my son moved among them, how relaxed he seemed. When someone introduced me, it was always briefly, my name mentioned quickly before the conversation moved on. I stood near the counter, refilling trays, wiping spills, listening to fragments of conversations that had nothing to do with me. More than once, someone assumed I was hired help. I corrected them quietly with a smile that felt practiced. At one point, I overheard my daughter-in-law speaking to a group near the living room. She talked about how hard it had been to build their life, how much pressure they were under, how little support they had received. Her voice was smooth, sympathetic. People nodded, offered kind words. I stood in the kitchen doorway holding a stack of plates and listened as my role in their story was quietly erased. I did not interrupt. I did not correct her. I simply returned to my task. Dinner was served, and finally I was invited to sit. The seat offered to me was at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door. Conversations flowed around me, over me. My son spoke proudly about their plans, their investments, their future. He did not look at me when he spoke. When he raised his glass to thank everyone who had helped them get where they were, his eyes scanned the room and moved past me without pause. Applause followed. I joined in softly, my hands barely making a sound. After dessert, my son stood again to make an announcement. He spoke about independence, about how important it was to stand on one's own, to not rely too heavily on others. The words felt deliberate, pointed. His wife smiled beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. A few people glanced in my direction, uncertain, then looked away. I kept my expression neutral, my posture straight. I felt exposed, as if something private had been displayed publicly without my consent. When the evening finally wound down and guests began to leave, I returned to the kitchen.
I washed dishes alongside hired staff who did not know who I was. My daughter-in-law thanked me briefly, already distracted by her phone. My son said he would call me soon. I nodded, gathered my coat, and left without being seen off. Outside, the air was cold. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, steadying myself, listening to laughter spill out behind me as the door closed. I walked to my car slowly, each step measured. The drive home passed in silence. When I reached my apartment, I sat at the small table and placed my hands flat against its surface. They were steady. That surprised me. I did not cry. I did not feel anger. I felt something else, heavier and clearer. A line had been crossed, publicly and deliberately, not through cruelty, but through dismissal, through the careful shaping of a story in which I did not exist. I went to bed that night with the image of my son raising his glass replaying in my mind, and with it a quiet understanding that whatever I had hoped for from him was no longer possible in the way I once imagined. Something was ending, though no one else seemed to notice yet.
The morning after the dinner, my body felt heavier than usual, not from age, but from the effort of holding myself together the night before. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if any sudden motion might crack something I had carefully sealed. I made my bed and opened the curtains, letting in a thin slice of winter light. It fell across the same furniture, the same walls, the same quiet that had greeted me for years. Nothing here had changed. And yet I felt as though I had returned from somewhere unfamiliar, carrying knowledge I could not put down. I replayed the evening again, but this time without excuses. I did not soften the edges or reinterpret intentions. I saw it as it was. I had not been invited as family. I had been used as labor, then positioned as an absence. The realization was not sharp. It was dull and persistent, like pressure behind the eyes. I ate a small breakfast and left the dishes in the sink longer than usual, a small rebellion no one would notice. Later that day, my phone rang. It was my son. He spoke casually, as if we had last seen each other under normal circumstances. He thanked me again for helping and said the event had gone well. Then, without pause, he mentioned a complication, a payment that had not gone through as expected. He asked if I could check on my end, maybe make sure everything was set up correctly. His tone suggested this was a minor inconvenience, something easily fixed. I listened, said I would look into it, and ended the call. I sat at the table and stared at the wall for a long time after that. Not because I was unsure what he meant, but because I was beginning to understand how automatic his expectations had become. My support was no longer something he asked for. It was something he assumed, something built into the structure of his life. The idea that it might stop did not seem to exist for him. That realization hurt more than the dinner itself. I went to the bank that afternoon, not with urgency, but with intention. The building was familiar, the same branch I had used for years. I greeted the teller by name and waited my turn. When I finally sat down with a representative, I asked for a full printout of my accounts, all of them. She glanced at me briefly, then complied without question. I thanked her and left, the stack of papers heavier than it should have been. At home, I spread them out across the table. I did not rush. I read carefully, methodically. The numbers told a story I had avoided reading in full. Payments scheduled monthly, weekly, some automatically renewing without notice. Subscriptions, insurance, utilities, credit lines, all connected to accounts I no longer actively used, but still funded. The total was larger than I expected, not catastrophic, but steady, draining, relentless. I traced each line with my finger, not angry, just attentive. What struck me most was how little of it was truly temporary.
Promises had been made early on, timelines offered casually, but nothing had ever been formally ended. I had been carrying responsibilities that no longer belonged to me simply because I had never refused them. The realization sat with me quietly. It did not demand immediate action, it asked only that I stop lying to myself. That evening, I received a message from my daughter-in-law. She said they might need additional help in the coming months because of new opportunities that required upfront investment. The words were polite, optimistic. She framed it as growth, as progress. I read the message twice and did not respond. Not because I was angry, but because I needed to understand what silence felt like before I used it. The days that followed were quiet. No visits, fewer calls. I noticed how my phone no longer felt like a tether pulling me toward obligations. Instead, it sat where I left it. I began to take longer walks, not to clear my head, but to inhabit my body again. I paid attention to small things, the way sunlight moved across the floor, the rhythm of my breath, the relief of not being needed for a moment. When my son finally called again, his tone was different, less casual. He asked if everything was all right. I told him I was fine. He hesitated, then asked if I had seen the message his wife sent. I said I had. There was a pause. He waited for more. I did not fill the space. Eventually, he said they were counting on me. The word landed heavily. Counting on me, as if I were a line item, a resource to be allocated. I told him I needed time. The words felt unfamiliar in my mouth, but not wrong. He did not like that answer. He reminded me of everything they were trying to build, of how important support was during critical phases. I listened, said nothing more than necessary, and ended the call. When I set the phone down, my hands were steady. That night I did cry, not loudly, not dramatically. I cried the way you do when something you believed in finally collapses under the weight of truth. I cried for the version of myself who thought endurance was the same as love. I cried for the years I had made myself small so others could feel large. When the tears stopped, I felt exhausted, but clear. I understood then that there would be no apology that could fix this, no conversation that could return things to what they had been. The break had already happened, quietly, publicly, repeatedly. What remained was not revenge or anger, but choice. And choice, I was beginning to learn, is a form of power I had underestimated for most of my life. I went to bed that night knowing that whatever came next would require patience. I would not explain myself. I would not announce anything. I would simply stop moving in the direction they expected. And as I lay in the dark, listening to the familiar sounds of my buildings settling around me, I felt the weight of something approaching. Not a decision yet, but the certainty that I would not endure this forever.
The weeks that followed did not announce themselves as different, but they were. I moved through them with a new kind of awareness, one that did not rush to justify itself. I still answered calls when they came, still responded to messages when silence would have created unnecessary drama, but something in my tone had changed. I no longer hurried. I no longer filled gaps. I spoke only when there was something I truly meant to say. This shift was subtle enough that no one confronted it directly, yet noticeable enough to create unease. My son called less frequently. When he did, his words were careful, as if he were testing unfamiliar ground. He asked general questions about my health, about my days, questions he had not asked in years. I answered them honestly but briefly. I did not offer extra details. I did not turn the conversation back toward his needs as I once would have done automatically. When the calls ended, I felt tired but not drained, a distinction I had never learned to make before. I spent more time alone, not out of isolation, but by choice. I rearranged my apartment slowly, moving small things, creating space where there had been clutter. I donated items I no longer needed, old clothes, unused dishes, objects tied to a version of myself that existed primarily in service to others. Each bag I carried out felt lighter than the last. I began to notice how little I truly required to feel steady. There were moments when doubt crept in, quiet moments, usually in the evening, when the day had settled and my thoughts wandered freely. I wondered if I was being unfair, if I was overreacting, if this was simply the natural distance that comes with age and change. Those thoughts did not overwhelm me, but they lingered, tapping gently at the edges of my resolve. I did not push them away. I let them exist. They deserved to be examined, not dismissed. One afternoon, I ran into an old coworker at the pharmacy. We spoke briefly, politely. She asked how my family was. I answered in the way people expect, with neutral words and a small smile. As we parted, she said something that stayed with me. She said I looked rested, not younger, not happier, rested. The word surprised me. I carried it home and turned it over in my mind like a fragile object. At home, I opened my notebook again, the same one I had kept for years, filled with reminders and obligations. This time, I did not write anything new. I simply reviewed what was already there. Names, dates, numbers, patterns. I was not preparing for anything specific. I was learning what had been asked of me and how often and at what cost. Knowledge, I was discovering, did not have to be weaponized to be powerful. Sometimes it was enough just to see clearly. Messages from my daughter-in-law continued, though their tone shifted. Where once there had been certainty, there was now suggestion. Where there had been expectation, there was phrasing that resembled politeness. She spoke of future plans, of possible needs, of flexibility. I replied when necessary, always with the same restraint. I neither agreed nor refused. I acknowledged. I delayed. Time, I had learned, was no longer something I owed freely. My son visited once during this period. He arrived without much notice, standing in my doorway with an uncertain smile. I invited him in. We sat at the table where so many decisions had been made for me without my participation. He talked about work, about stress, about the weight of responsibility. I listened. When he finished, he waited. I did not respond immediately. The silence stretched, not uncomfortably, but long enough for him to notice it. He asked if something was wrong. I told him nothing was wrong. I told him I was simply tired. The truth I had learned did not need to be dramatic to be effective. He seemed unsatisfied, but he did not press. When he left, he hugged me longer than usual. I stood still and allowed it, noticing how unfamiliar the gesture felt now that it was no longer transactional. After he left, I made tea and sat by the window. The street below was busy, people moving with purpose, unaware of the small recalibrations happening quietly above them. I thought about how many years I had lived in anticipation, always preparing for the next request, the next crisis, the next need. Anticipation, I realized, had been my default state. Letting go of it felt like learning a new language late in life. There were practical matters I attended to during this time, appointments, paperwork, conversations that had nothing to do with my son or his wife. I did not connect these actions to any larger intent, even in my own mind. I was not planning, I was stabilizing. There is a difference. Planning looks forward with purpose. Stabilizing creates ground under your feet so you do not fall when the ground shifts. Occasionally, guilt surfaced unexpectedly, not loud or accusatory, but soft and persistent. It asked questions without answers. What kind of mother steps back like this? What kind of woman chooses herself so late? I did not argue with the guilt. I acknowledged it. Then I returned to what I was doing. Guilt, I was learning, loses its power when it is no longer obeyed. By the end of that month, something inside me felt settled in a way it had not before. Not resolved, not finished, but aligned. I was no longer moving automatically in response to others. I was pausing, observing, allowing silence to do work I had previously done myself.
I knew this could not last unnoticed forever. Eventually, someone would push harder. Eventually, the absence of my usual compliance would be named. That knowledge did not frighten me. It steadied me, because whatever came next, I would meet it as someone who had already survived the slow erosion of being taken for granted. And that, I realized, as I turned off the light and lay down in the quiet of my own space, had prepared me for more than I had ever given myself credit for.
I began to notice things I had never seen before. Small details in my apartment, the way sunlight moved across the floor in the late afternoon, the faint hum of the radiator when the cold outside crept closer. I kept a journal again, something I had abandoned years ago when life had been too loud and demanding. This time, I did not write reminders or lists for others, nor did I record obligations I felt compelled to fulfill. I wrote about myself, the moments I noticed my own breath, the stiffness in my joints, the rhythm of my heart as I sipped tea. Writing became an act of presence, a quiet reclamation of time that had been spent anticipating everyone else's needs. Each entry felt like a small anchor, tying me to myself rather than to their expectations. During this period, my son and his wife continued their patterns, though now they were subtler. Requests arrived in text messages and emails, carefully phrased, with words that sounded polite but carried the same underlying expectation. Payments, errands, favors, all presented as minor necessities, framed as though I would naturally agree. I answered some, delayed others, ignored the rest. Each time I felt a flicker of something I had not felt in decades: control. Control without confrontation, without argument, without explanation. I discovered that power need not be loud to be real. It could exist quietly, patiently, almost invisibly, and still shift the balance of a relationship that had long been unbalanced. I began to watch them, quietly, from a distance, not physically, not by lurking or following, but with a kind of detached attention I had never permitted myself before. I noticed how they organized their schedules, how meticulously they timed their appointments, how effortlessly they celebrated minor achievements with friends, how dependent they were on the structures I had created. I observed the way they relied on others to maintain appearances, the way crises were rehearsed and rehearsed until they seemed real even to themselves. I did not intervene. I simply watched. There was clarity in seeing patterns without participating in them, in recognizing repetition without being trapped by it. It was almost like seeing a familiar play performed by actors who didn't realize their stage was mine to observe. At home, I began preparing my surroundings with intention. I sorted documents, bills, old receipts, and statements in neat stacks. I reviewed every account, every recurring payment, every automatic withdrawal that I had allowed to continue unquestioned. Not to act yet, not to confront, not to react, but to understand fully. The numbers told a story that no one else would ever see, a story of quiet erosion, of incremental loss, of years where I had quietly sustained their comfort at the expense of my own. I studied it all meticulously. I did not discuss this with anyone. There was no one to discuss it with, not truly. Even if I tried, words would feel insufficient. The truth was in the details, and the details required attention, patience, and a still mind. Evenings became the hardest part of my days. The quiet of my apartment, which had once been comforting, now felt heavy. Without the constant pull of their demands, I had more time to think, and thinking opened doors I had long avoided. I considered my life, the years spent accommodating, bending, anticipating. I thought of the repeated crises that were always urgent for them, but postponed for me. I thought of how I had learned to disappear while they occupied the center of every room, every conversation, every plan. And I understood something fundamental. Endurance is not the same as love. I also began to notice myself in ways I had ignored for decades. My breathing became deliberate, my posture straighter, the rhythm of my steps more deliberate. Tasks that had once felt exhausting now held a steady cadence. Folding laundry, washing dishes, balancing the books, these small acts became meditative, giving me back a sense of bodily presence that had long been surrendered to caregiving. I realized how much I had been defined by labor, by the quiet, invisible work of keeping everyone else comfortable. Slowly, deliberately, I began to unburden myself, not by dramatic withdrawal, but by choosing the moments when I would no longer participate, when I would simply observe and pause. There were days when guilt crept in, soft, insistent, whispering questions. What kind of mother steps back now? What kind of woman prioritizes herself so late in life? I did not fight these thoughts. I acknowledged them, let them exist, and returned to my work. Guilt loses its power when it is no longer obeyed, I discovered. It has no authority unless you grant it. And so I granted none. I let the questions hover and move on. My son called once in this period, unannounced. He came to the apartment, standing in my doorway with a hesitant smile, as if testing whether I would still welcome him without the usual arrangements. I invited him in, and we sat at the table where I had spent years preparing for his requests, the table where I had always been expected to respond immediately. He spoke of work, of stress, of responsibilities that seemed enormous to him. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he waited, expecting me to fill the silence. I did not. I simply breathed and allowed the quiet to remain. He asked if something was wrong. I told him no, only that I was tired. That was all. The pause that followed was long and uncomfortable. He searched my face for signs of complaint, for justification, for some familiar concession. I offered none. Eventually, he left. The hug at the door lingered longer than usual. I did not resist. I noticed for the first time in years how unfamiliar a gesture of affection felt when it was no longer transactional. After he left, I made tea and went to the window. The street below was alive with ordinary life, children running, neighbors speaking softly to one another, dogs walking obediently on leashes. I felt a quiet satisfaction in watching the world unfold without my interference, in seeing that my absence from certain routines did not create collapse, only subtle shifts. The practicalities of daily life continued. Appointments, bills, errands. I attended to them not as a servant to anyone else, but as a steward of my own life. I did not connect these acts to any grand plan. I did not prepare for confrontation. I stabilized. There is a difference. Stabilizing creates ground under your feet so you do not fall when everything else shakes. Planning anticipates a specific outcome. I was only strengthening my foundation, waiting patiently for what I knew would inevitably arrive. By the end of the month, something inside me felt aligned in a way it had never been. Not resolved, not finished, not triumphant, but aligned. I was no longer moving automatically in response to others. I was pausing, observing, allowing silence to do the work that used to exhaust me. I knew that eventually someone would notice, eventually someone would push harder. The absence of my usual compliance would not go unremarked. And yet that knowledge did not frighten me. It steadied me. I was prepared for what would come, not as a passive participant, but as someone who had survived decades of being taken for granted. I had cultivated patience, observation, and quiet intelligence, and now I could wait. I could wait for the right moment, the precise moment when what had been mine all along would be reclaimed. For the first time in decades, I felt a faint but undeniable sense of readiness, a small, steady flame of certainty that no one could diminish. I was present, I was aware, and I was finally beginning to feel the subtle, unwavering weight of power in patience. It began on a Tuesday morning that felt ordinary until it was anything but. I had just brewed my tea, the steam curling slowly from the cup, and settled at the table with my notebook beside me. The documents I had been organizing for weeks were stacked neatly in front of me, each folder a small monument to patience and observation. I reviewed bank statements, tracing each line with my finger, making sure I understood the flow of money I had allowed into their hands over years. The patterns were familiar, but now they appeared with startling clarity. Automatic withdrawals, recurring subscriptions, car payments, credit card charges, some authorized formally, others quietly assumed, 97 in total. Every one of them represented a choice I had made under pressure, a pattern I had never fully scrutinized, a lifetime of compliance I now saw in full. I did not act immediately. I poured a second cup of tea and leaned back, letting the realization settle like winter fog. The numbers were not catastrophic, but they were relentless. Each withdrawal had quietly fed a lifestyle far beyond what I could have provided myself, far beyond what was reasonable or fair. I traced the amounts and dates carefully, noting that each payment had become invisible in its repetition. It had taken years to see it fully, and yet here it was, undeniable, factual, quiet in its enormity. I felt neither triumph nor fury. I felt readiness. The control I had believed lost had been mine all along. I made a meticulous list, writing each account, each payment, and every schedule. There were car leases, insurance policies, luxury store transfers, credit card charges, subscriptions I had long ignored. I checked my authority on each account, ensuring the formal documentation was intact. Everything was under my name, either fully or jointly. Each line represented a choice I had made, and now I realized each line could be undone with clarity and calm precision. The thought did not exhilarate me, it steadied me. I felt the weight of responsibility, but also the relief that action no longer required chaos or confrontation. That afternoon, I called the bank. I asked to confirm the authority I had on every account, every recurring payment. The representative verified the details without hesitation. Everything was mine to manage, every cent, every automated line of support I had once assumed was indispensable. No one had thought to check. No one had imagined that I could, quietly, deliberately, revoke what they had long taken for granted. I scheduled cancellations in my mind, step by step, mapping the days when each one would cease. There would be no warning, no hint, no dramatic confrontation. It would be methodical, invisible in its execution until the results became unavoidable. I spent the evening reviewing property documents and legal papers I had long kept in a drawer. Mortgages, deeds, trust papers, life insurance forms, bank authorizations, everything lay quietly under my control. Each document reminded me of what I had always known in the back of my mind. I had authority I had never exercised fully. The years of silent labor had taught me patience, but also that power could lie dormant until properly claimed. That evening, as I sipped my tea and stared out the street at the street below, I realized I had both knowledge and opportunity. I did not feel vengeful. I did not feel triumphant. I felt alignment. The next morning, I began the first cancellations. The process was deliberate. I checked each account, verified dates, and paused before confirming. I imagined the moment they would first notice the absence of funds, the small disruption of habit, the subtle shock that follows long dependence. I did not rejoice, I simply observed my own calm. The act was not an eruption, it was the natural consequence of decades of careful attention, of finally recognizing what I had allowed and what I had the right to stop. By midweek, the first notices arrived. My son called, casually at first, then with rising tension as he realized that payments had not gone through as usual. He asked if there had been a mistake. I listened quietly, offering only acknowledgement.
No explanation, no apology. He probed gently, then more insistently, as though testing whether I had lost my mind, whether this was temporary, whether it could be corrected with a simple request. I said nothing beyond what was necessary. Silence became my response. Emails from his wife followed, polite, courteous, concerned. The words carried their usual charm, but now I read them differently. I could see the assumptions underneath, the unspoken expectations that had long been the pattern of our interactions. The tone was calm, almost rehearsed, but beneath it trembled a hint of uncertainty. My quiet inaction had disrupted the rhythm of their life. I had never needed to act violently or loudly. I had simply claimed my own authority. That in itself created change. As the week progressed, I reviewed statements again, confirming each cancellation. I observed the slow ripple of their awareness. Their world, once predictable in its reliance on me, began to wobble. Small, inconspicuous gaps appeared, a lease not paid on time, a subscription lapsing, a credit card balance unexpectedly altered. I did not take pleasure in the discomfort, I simply noticed it, allowing the natural consequence of my own decisions to unfold. The months of observation, of careful patience, of quiet intelligence culminated in these subtle but undeniable shifts. During this time, I also observed my own response. I did not feel guilt, or at least I did not let it control me. The small tremors of self-doubt arose, briefly as they always had, but I no longer reacted. I did not justify myself, I did not apologize. I allowed the knowledge of what had been happening to stand, and the power of understanding guided my action. I recognized the quiet strength in acting without drama, in reclaiming what was rightfully mine without spectacle. By the end of the week, the major lines of support had been severed. Automatic payments had ceased, accounts redirected, financial authority reclaimed. I did not wait for acknowledgement. I did not require apology. I had spent years cultivating patience, understanding, and quiet observation, and now the long overdue outcome was taking shape without the need for confrontation. They would discover the consequences of their assumptions, their patterns of dependence, their expectation that I would always provide. That evening, I sat at my table again, my notebook closed, my tea cooling beside me. The city outside hummed quietly, unaware of the subtle shifts occurring above it. I felt neither triumph nor malice. I felt readiness fulfilled, a sense of completion in observing, preparing, and finally acting with precision. I was no longer reactive, I was deliberate. The days ahead would reveal the consequences, and I would watch with the calm clarity that comes from decades of patient observation. For the first time in years, I understood that power need not be loud, that change need not be explosive, that authority could be exercised without malice or anger. It was quiet, deliberate, and inevitable. And as I sipped my tea, looking out at the same street where so many of my own choices had been invisible for decades, I felt something I had almost forgotten. The profound clarity of acting for oneself, finally, fully, without apology.
The days that followed the cancellations were quiet, but the silence carried weight. The house I had built within myself, the one where observation and patience had lived for months, now trembled slightly as consequences began to ripple outward. My son's calls came more frequently, shorter, sharper. He no longer spoke in casual tones. Every word was measured, tentative, as though testing a line he could not yet cross. His questions were pointed, but I answered with calm neutrality, careful not to give away anything I was not ready to share. The more he pressed, the more I realized how much he had relied on automatic compliance, how much his life had assumed my constant availability. The absence of that pattern unsettled him, and watching that subtle unease unfold became almost meditative. My daughter-in-law reached out as well, with her usual carefully crafted politeness, though now a faint strain of urgency threaded her words. She asked if everything was okay, if any errors had been made, if I needed to review something with her. I replied minimally, acknowledging receipt without explanation, without discussion. The tension in her messages was palpable, though unspoken. It was clear she was testing the waters, trying to gauge whether my withdrawal was temporary or absolute. For the first time, they had to consider me as someone who could choose, someone whose decisions were independent of their expectations. The first ripple of panic appeared in the smallest ways. A missed payment here, a subscription lapse there, a balance unexpectedly due. I observed each response quietly, noting how their carefully structured routines wavered when the steady flow of my resources ceased. No one yelled, no one threatened. The shifts were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to me they spoke volumes. They revealed patterns of dependence I had long tolerated, now visible in their disruption. And with each small revelation, I felt the calm assurance of knowing the truth and acting upon it. Evenings became a time of reflection, not fear or anxiety. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the street below. Life went on outside as always, unaware of the minor upheaval occurring in my own sphere. Children ran past, neighbors chatted on stoops, cars moved along familiar routes. I felt a strange sense of harmony in observing this ordinary continuity while my own life shifted quietly within the walls of my apartment. I had disrupted their rhythm, but my world remained steady. The contrast felt like liberation, like the air clearing after a storm had passed through unnoticed. There were messages from my son that evening, cautious, almost formal. He asked if I had reviewed certain statements, if I had considered reinstating payments. I replied briefly, only what was necessary, neither offering justification nor apology. I noticed the subtle frustration in his words, the uncertainty that arises when someone no longer operates under your assumptions. My own sense of calm deepened. For decades, I had been the one adjusting, the one accommodating, the one anticipating. Now I simply existed, quietly, fully, observing the results of choices I had long postponed. As the week progressed, I realized they were adjusting slowly to the absence of my automatic participation. The first day had brought anxiety and testing. By the third, the messages were more hesitant, fewer in number. I continued to respond minimally, always with calm neutrality. The absence of reaction was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. I noticed the tension that had clung to every interaction for years began to lift, though not entirely. They were aware of the shift, but it was subtle, the kind of change that could not be undone with a single gesture or explanation. It required time, awareness, and patience. I spent my own days differently now. Without the constant pull of urgent demands, I allowed myself to inhabit my routines fully. I cooked slowly, paying attention to the textures and smells of my meals. I walked in the late afternoons, noticing the angle of the sun and the patterns of shadows on the sidewalk. I tended to paperwork not out of obligation, but because it grounded me, created structure for my own life rather than theirs. Every choice felt deliberate, every action mine alone. The ordinary tasks that had once been invisible labor now became acts of self-possession. On one afternoon, I received a hesitant voicemail from my son. He spoke carefully, quietly, asking if we could meet to discuss things, as if unsure whether I would agree. I did not respond immediately. I thought about the years I had spent accommodating every request, the countless times I had smoothed over difficulties that were never mine to solve. I considered what it would mean to meet him now, on my terms, without relapsing into the patterns of the past. And I waited. Silence, I had discovered, was a kind of power in itself. The first face-to-face meeting came that weekend. My son arrived hesitant, with that familiar expression of urgency softened by uncertainty. I invited him in. We sat at the table where so many negotiations and crises had been rehearsed for years. He spoke cautiously about accounts, payments, and expectations. I listened, not interrupting, allowing the silence to stretch between us. The pauses were deliberate, letting him feel the absence of automatic compliance, the absence of unquestioned availability. He struggled, then faltered, realizing that the person who had always been a source of immediate resolution was no longer just a tool to maintain comfort. He asked if I was upset, if I felt hurt, if I wanted things reinstated. I said simply that I needed boundaries, that I needed to observe the consequences of repeated assumptions. I spoke calmly, measured, without drama or accusation. He listened, frustrated, uncertain, realizing that nothing he had done or said would instantly restore the previous pattern. And for the first time in decades, I realized that my choices had weight, that my decision to act quietly, deliberately, without spectacle, was enough to shift the dynamic entirely. By evening, I returned to my tea, sitting quietly by the window. The street outside remained ordinary, children playing, neighbors moving through their routines, cars passing along the familiar routes. I felt a strange sense of harmony in observing this ordinary continuity while my own life shifted quietly within the walls of my apartment. I had disrupted their rhythm, but my world remained steady. The contrast felt like liberation, like the air clearing after a storm had passed through unnoticed. I realized that freedom did not require confrontation. It required awareness, patience, and deliberate action. It required observing patterns for years, cultivating quiet intelligence, and finally, acting decisively without rage or apology. In the quiet of that evening, I understood that the consequences unfolding around me were not punishment nor revenge. They were simply the natural result of choices I had long delayed, executed now with care, precision, and unwavering attention. That night I slept deeply, without the habitual tension that had clung to me for decades. I understood, more clearly than ever, that the shift in my life had begun not with dramatic confrontation, but with patient observation, careful preparation, and deliberate action. I had reclaimed what had long been assumed, and in doing so, I discovered a quiet form of power, subtle but undeniable, and a deep sense of peace in the knowledge that, at last, I was acting for myself. The days that followed were quiet, but they were different from the quiet that had filled my apartment before. There was no sudden celebration, no confrontation, no grand announcement. Instead, there was a steady, unshakable sense of being fully present in my own life, a subtle liberation that grew stronger each morning. I moved through my routines deliberately, noticing small things I had never allowed myself to see before. The sound of the kettle boiling, the texture of the carpet beneath my feet, the way sunlight shifted across the walls of my apartment. These were ordinary details, but for the first time, I felt entitled to notice them, to exist in them without guilt or apology. My son and daughter-in-law adjusted to the new reality, though not smoothly. They called less often, and when they did, their voices carried caution and occasionally frustration. I listened politely, answered only when necessary, and allowed silence to stretch naturally. It was remarkable how quickly patterns of dependence unravel once the foundation that supports them is withdrawn. There was no drama, no confrontation, just the quiet consequences of choices long ignored. Each day their life grew slightly less entangled with mine, and with that came a clarity I had never felt before. I began to reclaim spaces and moments I had long ceded. I took longer walks, noticing the patterns of the neighborhood, the rhythm of life outside my windows. I cooked meals slowly, savoring textures and flavors I had ignored for decades while rushing to meet someone else's schedule. I returned to my journal, not to catalog obligations, but to reflect on my own thoughts, my own desires, my own plans. Each entry felt like a reclamation of self, a slow expansion of the life I had neglected while attending to others. I did not feel selfish, I felt whole. Financial independence, once abstract, had become concrete. The savings I had preserved, the accounts I had monitored, the documents I had studied, all of it now represented more than security, it represented freedom. I could live entirely on my terms. I could decide where to allocate my resources, how to spend my time, and whom to invite into my life without compromise. The control I had cultivated patiently, quietly, now existed without effort. It was steady, reliable, and entirely mine. I noticed, too, a change in how I felt in my own body. My shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't in decades. My back no longer bore the tension of constant anticipation. My hands no longer shook with the quiet stress of perpetual responsibility. I slept more deeply. I woke with intention rather than obligation. Each day became a small victory, not because of what I had done to others, but because of what I had reclaimed for myself. Messages from my son arrived sporadically, cautious, polite, sometimes hesitant. Once he sent a note that simply said, "I just want you to know I love you." I read it twice, feeling neither the urge to respond immediately nor the old compulsion to justify myself. I replied, "I love you too," and left it at that. There was no further explanation, no promise of assistance, no expectation that I would resume old patterns. The message was acknowledged, and then the space between us returned to normal, quiet, respectful, and clear. I realized that peace was not found in reconciliation, nor in forgiveness offered at the cost of oneself. It was found in boundaries, in recognition of one's own value, in the quiet knowledge that life belongs first to the person who lives it. I could care for others without surrendering myself, love without losing myself, give without destroying my own dignity. These were lessons decades in the making, lessons learned not through confrontation or fury, but through observation, patience, and the deliberate exercise of authority long assumed to be lost. Weeks turned into months. I settled into a rhythm of living for myself, observing quietly, acting decisively when necessary, and allowing the ordinary beauty of life to unfold. The apartment, once just a place to survive, became a sanctuary. Each object, each surface, each window now carried the weight of my choice rather than obligation. I noticed the small things I had long ignored, the faint scent of my chamomile tea, the way the evening air drifted through the open window, the shadows of leaves playing across the walls of my apartment. These were not mere details, they were markers of a life no longer defined by others. I discovered that independence was not just financial or practical, but emotional. I no longer measured my value by what I could provide, but who I was when I existed for myself. I noticed how rarely I had experienced this sense of sufficiency in my adult life. Even when surrounded by family, I had always been defined by the labor of care, by the weight of responsibility, by the need to anticipate and solve problems. Now that weight had lifted. I was free to notice, to rest, to choose without fear of judgment or expectation. One quiet evening, I made myself tea and sat on the small balcony overlooking the street. The sky was a soft gray, the city humming below it, oblivious to the subtleties of my life above it. I thought about everything that had led me here, the decades of giving, the years of quiet observation, the subtle accumulation of knowledge and patience, the moment I finally exercised authority over what had long been assumed to be lost. And I realized that This quiet, deliberate peace was more valuable than anything I had sacrificed for others. I did not expect applause or gratitude. I did not want reconciliation. I wanted presence. I wanted the knowledge that my life, after 70 years of giving, finally belonged to me. And in that moment, with the cool evening air on my face and the faint smell of tea, I felt complete. I did not need approval. I did not need acknowledgement. I was sufficient. I was free. I had learned finally that boundaries were not cruelty, and saying no did not make me unkind. It made me whole. When I went to bed that night, I lay on the new mattress that no longer hurt my back and felt something I had not felt in decades: deep, untroubled rest. My life, which had been defined for so long by obligation and expectation, was now defined by choice. I whispered quietly to myself, not as a triumph, not as a boast, but as truth. I had learned to take care of myself first, and in doing so, I had discovered the most profound freedom of all. My life belonged to me, and at last I could live it fully, peacefully, and with dignity.